The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
This morning we're looking at another parable of Jesus, the parable of the mustard seed. And so if you have a Bible, please could you turn to Matthew 13. If you don't worry, the words will be on the screen. Matthew 13, it's a very short parable, just 2 verses long. Matthew 13 and verse 31. He, Jesus, put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make their nests in its branches." And on the screen as well, there would have been a quote. We're struggling, are we? It's frozen. We won't say what make the laptop is. So, because it can happen to anything. It's technology for you. Let me just read this quote. It would have been more helpful if it had been on the screen, but that's life. What I mean is, it's a bit wordy. Michael Green said this. He's a commentator. He said, "In comparison with the massive edifice of pagan religion and the age-old splendour of Judaism, the infant Christian church must have felt very small and insignificant. The semi-literate first disciples of Jesus must have felt even more so." Now I want you to imagine that this whole stage is full of soil. It's a garden. There we go. So you can read it for yourselves. I want you to imagine this whole stage is just soil. It's a garden. I want you to imagine that I've taken this very small seed. It probably isn't the smallest, but Jesus was trying to emphasise a point. It is a small seed, the mustard seed. And I want you to imagine for a moment that I'm putting this mustard seed into the ground. And this mustard seed is you or me or the early church, those of you that are at school, those of you that are in your teens, those of you that are students at university. You know what it's like. I remember being at school. I remember feeling very insignificant. I remember feeling very small. I remember being in that context and thinking, what on earth does Christianity mean in this context? Nobody's interested. I'm very, very small and I'm very, very insignificant. I want you to just picture that Jesus talking about this small mustard seed. And every time you try and make a stand at school, or every time you try and make a difference, maybe even attempt to talk about God in any situation where it might seem appropriate, it's like you're just trying to survive sometimes. You make these little attempts, and you feel like you're in a jungle, and you're just a tiny, small seed with all these huge trees around you. How do we know that we're right? How do we know that how can a mustard seed be correct? It's so small. Is the church, is the kingdom of God, is it even meant to grow? Are we not meant to stay small and insignificant? Because it feels like we will. It feels so slow and so difficult. My main 2 points this morning are these. Number 1, small beginnings, but number 2, massive ending. Let me firstly say that small beginnings and even a small middle does not equate with being incorrect or wrong. Jesus was very happy with small beginnings, and we must be. Knowing Jesus is comfortable with small beginnings is a relief and a release to us, or should be. Jesus in this parable is saying a couple of things, but the main thing he's saying is this is my style. This is my style. This is the way I do things. What do you think of me now? What do you think of my way of doing things? Remember I said last time that all of the parables, underneath all of them is the question, what are you going to do with me? What are you going to do with this version of the Messiah? You didn't expect it. What are you going to do with Jesus? This is how my kingdom will work. It will work like a small seed going into the ground. And for ages looking very insignificant and very small. Remember, the kingdom of heaven that Jesus describes is a number of things, but it's his rule, it's his domain, it's his dominion, it's his authority, it's his values, it's his way of doing things. It includes his church, which he set up as a beacon of hope. It includes his church and local expressions of his church in churches. And he sets up these lamps so that people can come and nest and rest in these churches. But the kingdom is bigger than just the church. It includes the church as a big focus of the kingdom, but it's bigger than that. And the kingdom is not the actual mustard seed. The mustard seed is like an expression of the kingdom. The kingdom is already massive. The kingdom, in reality, is already huge. Jesus is already in charge. That's not the point. It's not like Jesus is saying, oh, we're going to just start again, me and the Father, and work from... No, the kingdom is already massive. It's his reign over the whole universe, including planet Earth. But the seed is like local expressions of it. The seed is like the gospel, the good news of Jesus, the message of Jesus, or it could be representative of you and me, making our little, like I was talking about being at school. Or it could be God's love working through us. That could be the seed. God's kingdom is massive, but how it looks to the world can start small. Can start small and underground. And that actually is the way God likes to do it. Jesus is saying, I'm not Saddam Hussein. I'm not Tony Blair. I'm not Donald Trump. I'm not the EU. I'm not some political organisation. I'm not Google. I'm not Amazon. I'm not Nike. I'm not a big global company. I'm not one of these big political figures. That's not me. He says in Matthew 11 verse 29, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. He's not trying to be an impressive political or military leader. He's interested in souls, not winning wars or elections. Jesus is saying, that's my style. That's the way I'm going to do this kingdom. It's underground. It's small to begin with. It's not impressive looking. And it might stay like that for a while, Jesus is saying. This minute grain of seed will become a giant plant. You see the picture there? You see the small mustard seed? You see what it can become. Apparently it could grow to like 4 meters tall, a mustard plant or a mustard tree or a mustard bush, whatever you want to call it. It was a messy plant. We'll come back to that in a moment. But it's tall, it's big. Compared to the size of look at it in that person's fingers. The growth is massive. The growth is incredible. Tiny to this huge thing. But it will start small. And that's Jesus' style. That's God's style. Gideon's army, God just kept whittling the thing down. If you know the story in the Old Testament, Gideon had this army and God said to him, well, let's make it smaller. And this process went on where it got smaller and smaller so that God's power could be displayed. Then we know like Elijah, we know about him. We know he was one man against all these prophets of Baal, and again with God's massive help, overcame. Rahab, one woman, made a small, bold stand and became a part of a massive history of God. Ruth, making a seemingly small, loyal decision to follow Naomi. She ended up being... that initial decision made her even smaller and more vulnerable, actually. But in the end, she became a part, again, of God's massive history. Friends, this is not just cool. It's not like when mobile phones, which some of you are still on at the moment. It's not just about mobile phones. Some of you are reading the Bible and some of you aren't. It's not just about mobile phones when, I don't know if you remember in the early noughties, maybe it was before that, when the thing to do was to make the phone smaller. So Nokia mobiles, although you can get other makes, Nokia mobiles just got smaller and smaller. Now they're going bigger and bigger. It's not like we're saying small is cool. Some people think small church is cool. It's not like, the smart car came out and it was cool because it was so small. Although I wouldn't want to be in one if somebody hit you. But anyway, that's another point. It's not that small is cool. It's not that small is trendy. It's just the way Jesus does it. And I really want to communicate this morning. It's not a nice idea. It's the way God seems to have always done it. He's always done small to start with. To start with. You think, well, hang on a minute, really? Yeah, think about Jesus. The Saviour of the world was a vulnerable small baby in a backwater called Bethlehem in a stable. He was a baby. The Saviour of the world was born as a baby. If it was up to us, we would have come in with, sponsorship. Nike would have been all over it. We would have been straight into some political entity, some sort of big military entrance. That's the way you and I would have done it, and that's the way that they expected it at the time, which is why when Jesus says we're going to start small, it was a shock to them. But do you know what? It's been God's way the whole time. He started with Abraham, one man. And he said to Abraham at the beginning, you're going to be a father of multitudes, that so much so that you won't be able to count it. It'll be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. You won't be able to count it. You won't be able to count how many people are in this thing. And he's like, well, it's just me. Yeah, I'm going to start small. It's the way I've done it it's the way God's done it with the Jewish people. It's the way God's done it with the church. It's the way He's always done it. So I'm just trying to communicate this, and I hope you're getting it. It's not like sometimes God does small. He always does small to start with. And we don't need to panic. I think, it's still so small. Or, I feel so insignificant, I'm going to give up. I'm going to take on some sin. I'm going to get into some sin because I'm a bit fed up with how long this thing's taking. It just sometimes takes time. And it's okay that it's small. We don't give up either on a biblical model for church, because some people think, trying to go for gifts of the Spirit in worship as a church just doesn't work now. People don't like it. New people, they don't stick in your church if you have too much of that stuff going on. No. We actually think that's in the New Testament. We actually want to keep going for that. Even if it means we don't grow as fast as we might do. We actually think that that's so important. We're going to keep going for that. So we don't go looking for significance in ways that aren't helpful. So we don't go spending money in some splashy, flashy way, trying to be something we're not, because we're okay with the fact that to start small is God's way. That makes sense? I'm going to get onto the fact that it finishes big, but we want to start here. We have to start here. But it does end massive. It will end big. Secondly, the question is, does all of this stuff we've just been looking at, that mean that actually we'll go from being small and insignificant to Jesus returning and suddenly big? Will it just kind of stay like this, small, and then suddenly, boom, every eye will see and every knee will bow? Or is there something more gradual? There is something more gradual, we'll see. It isn't that we stay small, and then suddenly Jesus comes back. Is small better? Some of you might ask. If we suddenly became a church of 1,000, surely small's better. Small's more authentic. I get to chat to people a bit more. I get to feel a bit... No, actually, small isn't necessarily better. I've heard that argument before. We had a church plant that started with 20 people. And as we got bigger, people began to not like it because they liked small. Let's be clear, God starts small, but He doesn't intend for it to stay small. And some people think actually small is more authentic, staying small is more Jesus' style. It isn't. It really isn't. Early church went from 0 to 60 in about 1.1 seconds, to use car analogy. Day of Pentecost, they went from 0 to 100 or so, or a couple of hundred to 3,000 in one day. God's not bothered about big. But he does start small. It's meant to become big. And it's not like we're waiting for Jesus to come back. Some people think, well, we're going to just stay small, insignificant, under the radar, and then suddenly, boom, Jesus comes back. And like I just said already, the language that we're seeing in this parable more than suggests that it's not just small, boom, end times. No. The language suggests that actually birds will come to nest in this tree, in this plant, in this huge mustard tree. Birds will come in. And as we'll see in a moment, birds, in their eyes, as the hearers would have understood it, birds refer to the nations, believe it or not, coming in. But we'll come back to it in a moment. So it's not like it's the end times. It's got to have more of a now meaning for these nations to come in now and enjoy God in this mustard tree. Does that make sense? Does the mustard tree, here's another question, does the mustard tree guarantee quick growth? Well, no. Plants, I don't know if you do any gardening, or if you know anything about it, it does my head in. Plants take forever. We've had this thing, I think it's called a hydrangea. I don't even know how you say it properly. We were given it by Pete and Sue Linden, who used to be in the church here, and they gave us this hydrangea when we moved in about 3 years ago, and it was so big. And it's still not much bigger, but it started to flower. 3 years of nothing. 3 years before you see a flower on this thing. I mean, it's not like we've put it in, the work. It's not like we've just dumped it on the grass. We stuck it in some decent soil. 3 years. Do me a favour. Our generation can't cope with that. I want it yesterday. Like in Dubai, where some of our family live, if they want a row of palm trees on a side of a road, going right down the length of a road, they don't put palm tree saplings in. They bring in fully grown, matured palm trees. Wham! They're in. Full on, instant effect. That looks like a row of palm trees. We're not waiting for this thing. We're not waiting 5 or 10 years for them to grow. Forget it. We'll just buy them in. That's what our generation wants. So we can't cope with a mustard seed going in the ground. First of all, we can't cope with it being small and insignificant. Then we can't cope with the fact it's going to take years. Years. I can't cope with it. I'm sure you're the same. Sometimes I think, how long is this going to be? I want it yesterday, if I'm honest. Okay, so it's going to take time. So if we can cope with that, fine. But here's another question. Does this parable mean that we can guarantee that this will eventually be a massive church? That Christ Central Manchester will eventually be, however long it takes, guaranteed thousands? Or does this parable mean that Manchester, all of Greater Manchester, will one day be saved? Does it guarantee that? Or on an individual level? Does this parable guarantee that maybe even after some time, like Hannah, for example, going into her new job in a new location, does this parable guarantee to Hannah and to all of us individually that I will have a very significant role to play in my life? Does it guarantee that I'll have influence in my life over hundreds and thousands of people? Does it guarantee that, even if it takes some time? Sadly, no. Doesn't guarantee any of that. Doesn't guarantee a massive church. Doesn't guarantee all of Manchester will be saved. Doesn't guarantee that all of us individually will have incredibly influential lives. Some versions of Christianity around the world would like to suggest that if you believe in Jesus and follow him, you'll end up rich and so influential you won't know what to do with it. So powerful. Because you're a believer, you're a son or a daughter of the king. Well, John the Baptist kind of went out with a whimper. He wasn't much older than Jesus. He'd half lived. Now, we know he's significant because of looking back. But for him at the time, he was just a religious nutcase who got his head chopped off for being too zealous. And I can tell you other stories. There's no guarantees of massive growth. There's no guarantees of massive influence. You're thinking, this sermon's taken a real nosedive. I was all right till then. could just about cope with the thing taking forever. Now you're telling me there's no guarantee of anything exciting. Just get off the stage, Keith. Come on. Let me bring in some buts, some howevers. The now and the not yet of God's kingdom. So God's kingdom is this domain, this rule of God over the whole universe. One day it will be fully expressed. Every eye will see, every knee will bow when he comes back. Which is why these cults that say Jesus came back in 1918 and lived in London, these kind of different weird ideas that are out there. Every eye will see. He won't go into hiding. Every eye will see. So we know that there is a glorious end coming. What we also know is the now and the not yet means it might start small and it might start slowly, but this thing will grow. When you read the New Testament, you read the letters of Paul, he's not in defeat. It's hard work, but he's not saying, oh, we're never going to get there. Forget it, let's just give up. No. He's expecting and he's seeing, he says things like the gospel is bearing fruit all over the world. This thing is on the up. This trajectory is, it's going. We're going somewhere. There's an onwards and an upwards about it. Now, there will be moments where it doesn't feel like that. There'll be moments when John the Baptist is beheaded. There's moments when there's persecution. There's moments when there's suffering. There's moments when people die of cancer and we don't know why. There's moments where churches split. There's moments where churches don't grow. There's moments where people sin and fall into it, whatever. There's moments when it goes wrong. But the general trajectory is onwards and upwards to this glorious end. So we don't get disheartened. We look for what God's doing. So when we send Jeremy and Anne off to Lima, Canada, all these exotic places. Zambia, not that exotic. I mean, it's exotic, but not always easy. I'm not saying it's a jolly. It's hard work. And that's what we see in the New Testament. Paul saying, we've just worked hard. But when we send Jeremy and Anne off to these different places and get behind them in prayer and hear reports back, we're expecting to see increase. And they're expecting to see impact and growth. This seed will grow. And when you've stepped out of school and felt insignificant because you've not laughed at that dirty joke that was told, or you've not watched the video that they're all watching, when you've made a stand in university, when you've made a stand, and to be honest with you, it's no different in any other context, work, it's just I think school's harder. Because people are generally a little bit more polite later on. Or they say it behind your back. When you make those stands, it is going somewhere. It really is. Jesus knows what his hearers will be thinking when he brings in this imagery of the birds. There will be a case. What it would have brought to their minds was places like Ezekiel 17 and Daniel 4, that the Gentile nations, these birds, these Gentile nations would come in. When we make a stand, Jesus is saying, this thing will grow when we go for it. When we send Jeremy and Anne, when we go for it in our localities, this thing will grow and the nations will come. The people who need help will come. The ones that think they've got it together, they might not come. But the ones that know they need God, they will come and they will rest and they will nest. Don't be afraid of the small. But don't get comfortable with the small either. If you sit on that mustard seed for too long, you'll end up with a really sore bottom. And you'll end up surrounded by branches. You'll end up stuck in the middle of a big mustard tree. You'll need to move. You'll need to help. You'll need to watch it grow. We're going to look at the next parable next week of the leaven, the yeast. But there's something in what Jesus is even saying with this mustard tree that I said we'd come back to. Look at the state of it. It's not pretty. Yeast wasn't thought highly of. You threw yeast out of the house before Passover. You got rid of it. That was an eyesore. They never planted them in their actual gardens. This is why it's a shock. You never planted a tree in your garden because you were supposed to, as a good Jewish person, you were supposed to keep everything neat and tidy. Things weren't allowed to cross lines and touch each other. That would have been a nightmare. Jesus is saying this thing is not pretty, as we'll see next week. This is not the pretty, successful people. This is the ones I'm going to call. And there'll be tax collectors, and there'll be the ones that society wants to get rid of, the yeast that they want to get rid of, the mustard tree that's not pretty, that just grows everywhere. But you see, I'm going to grow this thing, and I'm going to use it to save the nations, and they're all going to come to this tree. That's Jesus' style. Absolutely love it. Goes against all the norms. It's not fashionable, he's not trendy. In the 1800s, missionaries from the UK would have felt very insignificant as they visited the vast and daunting country of China. People like Hudson Taylor and many other less well-known missionaries. Many decades later, the mustard tree, and they may not have ever seen it, many decades later in China, the mustard tree was huge. Many, many people have come to find shelter in that tree. In the Telegraph online just this week, I read this. One example is a church in the town of Lushi, 200 miles south of Shanghai. It was founded in 1886 by William Edward Suttill of Yorkshire. He was a missionary that went out there. He was a future Oxford University professor, but he began to evangelise that local community 200 miles south of Shanghai. By the late 1950s, as the region was engulfed by Mao's violent anti-Christian campaigns, the church was forced to close. Lushi remained shut throughout the decade of the Cultural Revolution that began in 1966, as places of worship were destroyed across the country. Since it reopened in 1978, its congregation has gone from strength to strength as part of China's officially sanctioned Christian church, along with thousands of others that have accepted the Communist Party oversight in return for being allowed to worship. Today, it has 2,600 regular churchgoers and holds up to 70 baptisms a year, according to its 27-year-old pastor, whose name I can't pronounce. China's Protestant community, which has just 1 million members in 1949, China's overall Protestant Christian community was 1 million in 1949, has already overtaken those of countries more commonly associated with evangelical boom. In 2010, there were more than 58 million. Now, there's a population in China of 1 billion, but they're getting on for 10% of their population are Christian in a country that doesn't want religion. By 2030, China's total Christian population, including Catholics, is expected to exceed 247 million of its 1.3 billion population. Do the maths, that's quickly, not very difficult to do the maths, that's pushing quarter of the population will be Christian in a communist country that doesn't want to be known for religion. Absolutely brilliant. Come on. The tree will grow. It will start small, and people may not have ever seen the end, but it will grow. And in closing, if the band would like to come up, if only we could time travel back and meet up with, what was his name? William Edward Suttill. If we could only time travel back to 1886 and tell him that one day there'll be pushing 100 million Christians in China, or at the moment 58 million. If we could go back and tell him, if we could go back, time travel back to the early church and tell them what it would look like. If only our future generations in Manchester could time travel back to us and tell us what your little stand in the playground or in the canteen or your little stand at work, what all of that sowing of seed ended up with. If only somebody could come back from 50 years' time to tell us what it looks like. If only we knew that what our being sown into the ground with our selfless, self-embarrassing, self-humiliating actions would lead to. If only we knew. If only we knew what this small beginning, and it is small, in the comedy store, if only we knew what this ended up looking like. In one way, we do know. We don't necessarily know the details, we don't necessarily know the journey, but here is a promise. God always starts small, and he always grows his kingdom expressions, and he will grow his church, and the gates of hell stand no chance. He's in charge of his kingdom. It's not us that's in charge of this kingdom. It's not us and our clever ideas, it's God. If only you knew. Take courage. We know the end is massive and glorious, and in the meantime this kingdom will grow. It's on an upwards and onwards trajectory. Multitudes, nations will flock to its branches for help and safety. We know all of that.